You see, we're wishing you all a happy Thanksgiving. Okay, our first question, we've been actually getting this one quite a bit in a variety of forms, is about students attending a non-chartered, non-public school. There are a lot of questions around who is responsible for the evaluation and the IEP. This has not changed. It is the same as it's always been, and that is that when there is a non-chartered, non-public school, the district where that school is located is responsible for all aspects of child find. So the district where the school is located is responsible for conducting child find, doing an evaluation, and then would also be responsible for writing an IEP for that student. The one exception to this, and this has come up a few times too, so I just wanted to mention this, is if you're talking about a scholarship situation. That is a slightly different, and that is that if the child has not yet enrolled in the school, then the district of residence is responsible for conducting that evaluation. However, once the student is already enrolled, then it still falls back to the district where the non-public is located. One thing I will say is once a child is identified by that district, they will and should explain to the family that their district of residence must offer FAPE and is responsible for providing that if the family chooses to leave the non-public and re-enroll or enroll in their district of residence. However, the district of residence, unless that happens, they bear no responsibility. So I hope that's clear for everyone. Okay, so the other question we've been getting a lot is about open enrollment, and these kind of go together, so we tried to group things. That if a student is open enrolled, who is responsible for providing special services, including special transportation? And very similarly, the district who allowed the open enrollment, so if you accept a student as an open enrolled student, then your district is responsible for providing any and all services that that student would require. You must provide FAPE and all related aspects of that the same as you would for a student who was homegrown, so to speak, in your district.
Okay, any questions?
Okay.
All right, now we have an example. We were sent an example and we're going to go through it and read it and let you know whether it's compliant or not compliant. And if not compliant, we will give the reasons why and how you might fix this. When given a writing prompt and one teacher prompt, student will type a 3 to 5 sentence extended response with a relevant topic sentence and concluding sentence and correct grammar mechanics, putting in parentheses, capitalization, punctuation, and spelling with 80% accuracy in 3 out of 4 trials. We're not going to go down into the objectives because it's just kind of telling you, and you can see it on the screen, how they would break down the objectives. So what we're going to say, this is non-compliant. And we're going to show you and give you reasons why. The first reason, when you're doing one prompt, one teacher prompt, you need to say whether it's a verbal or gestural or physical prompt, because that's still unknown.
And it wouldn't matter who was providing that prompt. It could
Exactly.
be the teacher, it could be a related service person, a paraprofessional. You have to explain what the prompt is.
Okay, student will type a 3 to 5 sentence extended response, and you don't really need relevant because if it would be relevant with a topic, sentence, and concluding sentence and correct grammar mechanics. Okay, what we have are 2 skills still lumped together. So, and because I know people think if we were saying you can, there's certain ways you can write something where you can incorporate 2 skills, but with a rubric and the way you do it. However, in this you're talking about structure or mechanics. So you can't really lump structure and mechanics together. You can sometimes do it with a rubric, but I would kind of steer away from it because structure is totally different than mechanics.
And if you attended our IEP deep dive, which will now be known as Beyond Compliance.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Helen. You've heard us say and give an example very similar to this and have pretty in-depth discussion on why. And we've even had people push back and say, well, if it's a cohesive paragraph, you can't understand the meaning and the structure without mechanics. And we said, nope, that's not true. If you've ever played the little game where you are looking at a paragraph that's one giant run-on sentence with words that are only a few letters, there's absolutely no punctuation, spelling, capitalization of any kind, you can still read it and make sense of it. And that, again, just goes to show that there are two completely different skills, and structure is about conveying meaning and being able to accurately explain your thoughts in a way that the reader can understand. Mechanics is mechanics. And so that's what we always say, which are you measuring? Because you can't be measuring both. And like Helen said, our only exception to that, and we, again, caution, we really would only want to see that for maybe a junior or senior in high school, because one of the standards is the writing process. And if you had a very well-crafted rubric that was going to address each of those components, then you would need to write the goal differently. But then it would be that given a 5-paragraph essay or something like that, that the student would, score at least 80% given a rubric and, in 5 attempts or something like that, in 3 out of 5 writing submissions. But again, we urge caution in that folks don't take that and run with it and try to do that for younger grades and every time you want to have a writing goal. And we always say, pick which one of those is the most impactful for the student. And if a teacher argues back they're equal, then have 2 separate goals.
Yeah, and you could have 2 separate goals, but also, and if parents push back a little bit, the IEP is what you're taking data on. Doesn't mean you could be doing a writing response, and like we said, that's making sure people convey ideas, but you're still grading for mechanics, but you're not writing a goal necessarily on the IEP. Doesn't mean that the only thing we do in our classrooms are IEP goals. That's just what we take data on. So that's another way. Are there questions on that?
No.
Nope. Okay.
Okay, so everybody feels comfortable with the explanation of why this would not be compliant?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, good. Okay, and just as a reminder, one of the things, we know that you guys are doing a great job in sharing this back with your teachers, but constantly reminding them that the goal must stand alone, and so they can't rely on the objectives to make it compliant.
Right.
It has to be able to stand alone, and so when reviewers look at goals, they don't even look at the objectives. So just because of the lumping of the skills, that would nullify this. And again, like Helen pointed out, the teacher prompt and the word striking the word relevant, those aren't compliant issues.
Right.
We're just sharing that you want to be as concise as possible and make that goal as clear as possible for everyone who's going to be working on it.
Okay, now we're going to talk still about goals. I was starting to get ahead of myself with alternate assessment. Is it okay to use 100% accuracy as a criteria in a goal? Well, basically you wouldn't want to use 100% accuracy if you are starting at a fairly low base, because also it doesn't, that's a big gap to try to reach in a year. Also, if you have it, like say you're at 85, 90%, is that a goal that you want to prioritize? Also, if you're doing 100% accuracy, you leave no you leave no margin for error. So what I will say, if you're doing like a safety type thing, you would certainly, like crossing the street, yeah, you'd want to use 100%, but you're really not going to use accuracy, because you really don't use accuracy to measure behavior.
Yeah. And usually when we would see a safety goal like that, where something's at 100%, that is almost always physical therapy. And it would be something like crossing the street. Obviously, we don't want a student to get 60% across the street. But again, the state does allow a little bit of leeway for some of those very specific therapeutic goals. But as a general rule, in any goal, and certainly any academic goal, like Helen said, there's no margin for error, and we don't expect that from typically developing students. So, why would we do that to our students with disabilities? And again, just as a reminder, you've heard us say this before, and Helen already kind of alluded to this, you can't measure behavior with accuracy. Can't manage anger or use coping strategies with accuracy. You either do it or you don't.
Okay. Now we will start talking about alternate assessment 2.0. I don't know how many people that are on have, we gave some updates previously in the year, but things have changed quite a bit from what we were told in the spring, and then what we were told on November 7th, if anybody was at forum. You knew, or that we were at that time attending alternate assessment training.
And since you guys were so loyal and joined us today, you are getting a sneak preview of some of the info that's going to be shared out from our office.
Yes.
We are going to send out a formal email blast with sort of a bulletin memo from us detailing some of these things, but you're going to get to hear it today. But I don't want you to feel like you have to be in a frenzy to take notes, because you're going to get an email from us probably today or tomorrow reiterating this information. And then obviously we'll be going much more in depth during the trainings. But these are things that we really felt like directors and coordinators, you really would want to know ahead of time.
Because quite honestly, when we were at the training, we were like, why didn't we know some of this back in the spring, or at least have an update prior to our training in November? But still, I'm sorry, I don't want to freak you out. So
we'll just go ahead and share.
Okay. Must all students who are taking the AA take the online test? No, it's an individual decision. Most students will probably take the online test, but just the same as students without disabilities, you can take the paper pencil, or you can take what is being called supplemental, where you do part online and part paper. It really depends on the student and whether they need tactile things, whether they need things spread out, because I will tell you, the student will not have to necessarily point to stuff on the screen. The teacher can do that and ask questions, but so the answer to that is it's an individual decision.
Right. So again, there are 3 versions: fully online, supplemental, where they take the test online, but they're looking at some paper materials for those response cards that can be cut apart, and then all paper, which would look very similar to what it looked like before.
Yeah, and the test is still going to be different. I mean, I don't know if we have these in the upcoming questions, but we do, I think. So Helen likes to always jump ahead. So I will be quiet now, and we will talk about them when they come up. So number 6 is, do high school
May I ask
students...
you a quick question?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No.
Go ahead.
When I spoke with ODE about the different versions, they made it clear that it would have to be in the IEP that they are tested either with the supplemental or the paper.
Yep,
Yes.
we're going to get to that.
Yeah.
Oh,
And that's,
you are? Okay.
oh, yes,
Thank you.
and that's where we all kind of fell out of our chairs saying, why didn't we know this ahead of time? So, yeah, we will get to that.
Yeah, and what we can say is we apologize. We literally learned this on the 7th, had no advance warning, or we would have had the message out to our districts to know that. But you are correct, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as our questions go on about what you need to do if you are using the supplemental materials or the paper version.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so, and this will probably, this kind of rocked some people's worlds too, because I had said last year that we were told that students in high school would still, because we know we have all gone to grade level only, not grade bands as in the past. So students still until later a couple years from now would only take the test in 10th grade. However, that is being changed, but it is still an option for districts as far as you can test all in the 10th grade. You can decide to test a student in 9th grade on ELA, math, whatever, in 10th, another in 11th. They just don't want you testing everybody, you know, in their senior year. But this is why this question came up. I had a director call me prior to, well, right after we went to the training, saying, oh my gosh, does this mean the student has to keep retaking the test until they are proficient? Because, like I said, it was still going to be just the 10th grade. And she said, are we going to do 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade until they get proficient? No, they will only take, you can excuse them from the consequences. And another question that came up from another director was, does that mean end of course exams, they have to take like 2 ELA, like say you take one in 9th grade and 10th grade? No, they take 1 ELA, 1 math, 1 science, and 1 social studies or history. And that will be your decision if you still want to do it all 10th grade, or if you want to break them up. I think the idea is to try and align with end of course exams, but it's still a district decision.
And that doesn't mean that all of your students have to do it the same way either. It's an individual decision. So if you decide that you want to do 1 test in 9th grade, you know, 1 all 4 years, you can, or you can combine them in any way you see fit for that student.
And we'll go in, I think like I said, I like to, you know, jump ahead sometimes. We'll go into a little bit more on this, plus we will, will be coming out in the email, plus we will be explaining this at the trainings.
Okay, any questions thus far, or do you want us to go ahead and move on?
Oh, please keep going.
Okay. All right, so must high school students take the content specific test in a specific order? We already kind of talked about the second part of this, taking them all in the same year. And just like Helen already said, you can combine them any way you want. And as far as the order, no, you do not. So you do not have to take, you know, English language arts first and then math. Again, the goal is to try to make them mirror end of course exams, but there's still a lot of flexibility with them. And it really is make the decision that you think is best for your student. So if you think it would be less stressful and better for a student to take all 4 in 1 year, then do that. If you think that one a year is all they can handle, you have that flexibility.
And I would still try to stay away from taking, well, they could take 1 in their senior year,
right.
But I'd kind of try to stay away from just doing it in their senior year.
Well, and they don't want to see that. They do not want to see students taking all of the exams in their senior year, because then you've closed the window on them retaking them. And again, they don't have to retake them. You can excuse them. But if you were going to give the student another opportunity to take the test, it would be difficult to do that if you waited until their senior year. So don't wait until their senior year.
Okay, is the administration manual available online? And we just had a question on this yesterday because it's not. And I know a lot of people are going into the portal and, you know, trying to get pre-IDs and whatnot. The administration manual is being revised. It should be out on December 4th. We actually had kind of a draft copy, but not everything in it was correct. So it will be coming out on December 4th, which will help, as it has in the past, explain a lot of this.
And we will say that although the administration manual is not available right now, you are
Yes.
able to go onto the portal and access the resources that are there, just like they've always been in the past. There is a practice test, and what the expectation from ODE is that teachers will use that practice test and districts will use that as your litmus for whether or not the student needs supplemental materials. So that can be used as a tool to help you decide. Having said that, we do not want to insinuate that you
No.
can't make that decision without testing the student using the practice test. We know that you know your students quite well, and obviously you probably have a very good sense of whether or not they need those supplemental materials, or the completely paper version of the test. We just want you, we just wanted you to know that that is available.
Right, because I know most teachers are not going to have time to go in and do an online test, or they can view it, but for the students we're talking about, the 1%, most teachers that work with these students pretty much know whether they're going to need, like Dee Dee said, online, supplemental, or all paper. So, and that gets to our our next question when people are saying, well, how will I know? Because, it being online, must they touch it? Must they do this? If the student is taking the online test, must he operate the mouse, or can the teacher click the response for him? The teacher can click the response for the student. They don't have to use the mouse. They don't have to touch the screen or whatever. However, I'm going to tell you one caveat to this. It's an online test, and it has to be read by
Text to speech.
text to speech. However, the teacher can go back and read any parts to the student, but they have to read it they have to let text to speech read it ahead of time. And I know that in and of itself can be confusing for some of our students. So, but that is the way the test is set up. Just we'll make sure your teachers know they can go back, reread. They can reread the test reread the test questions and the choices.
Right, and just one of the things that we would say when making a decision about the version or the mode that the student will utilize is in order for them to be able to access the online version only, they're just going to need to be able to indicate a response when looking at a computer screen. Like Helen said, they don't have to manipulate the mouse, but they have to be able to clearly indicate their choice from the response items.
And I did clarify, because in the past with the paper test, we were allowed to say, is it this one? Is it this one? Is it this one? And you can say that also by pointing to it on the screen.
Yeah, so the teacher can point to the items on the screen to elicit an answer from the student. Okay, can the online test be administered on an iPad, Chromebook, desktop, or all three? And the answer to that is yes. Any device that allows you to access the portal, you can utilize. And we would also say that for our students who are nonverbal and maybe using some kind of augmented communication device, absolutely you should be utilizing that during the test. And that was true even when we were using a paper test. And that would be true for any of the versions. You want to make sure that however the student communicates on a daily basis, they're using that same method during testing. And if they are used to looking at things on an iPad, on a Chromebook, whatever the case may be, that is how you would want to present the test, because we want to maintain consistency. So the only thing we would say is if you choose to use an iPad, Chromebook, desktop, we would not suggest mixing those. We would want you to maintain that consistency. So if you start the test on an iPad, you should utilize the iPad for the duration of the test.
And before we go into any questions there, before I add a little comment here?
No.
Okay, what I want to say, even though there are 3 modes for the test will be the same as far as they all will have 50 questions. So it won't be like in the past where you have to figure out where the student starts on this test, where the student ends on the test, and all that that we had to do in the past. Or so it'll be 50 questions, whatever mode you use. I will say there will not be basically no response. What will happen, even though it really is a no response, it'll be, I think, a no. But if the student, and they suggest not doing it if, 1, 2, 3, 4, but if a student gives no response, 1, 2, maybe you try it another day, but once they get to 4 and there's no response from the student, the test is completed.
Right. So in the past, you had to go on and pick up at this number and continue. You had a certain duration of number of items that had to be completed, and that is no longer true. So for some of our students that are very, very medically fragile or very involved, and it's less torturous. So once there are those 4 non-responses, the test ends and they're done. So okay, so we're going to start talking about a couple of the additional bits of information that we felt you needed to know now. Again, these will be on that sort of official from SST8 memo that's going to come out today or tomorrow. But take a deep breath and don't anyone fall out of your chair or pass out. But because the version of the test is now officially an online assessment, that now means that if you use any of the supplemental materials, which means some of those paper materials, like we said, where their response items could be cut apart, laminated, whatever you need to do. If you use either the supplemental or the full paper, it doesn't matter. They both constitute paper. Then that now is considered an accommodation, and it must be documented in the IEP unless you're a board resolution district. And we have very few of those. So that would be the only exception to that. If a district had a board resolution, for example, that all 3rd graders will take the paper version of the 3rd grade reading guarantee and all students will take a paper test, that's the only way you don't have to mark it as an accommodation in the IEP. For everyone else, this now has to be marked in the IEP. So what you're going to do is in section 12, you're still going to check that yes, the student is participating in the alternate assessment. But then below that, where we would normally reserve that for end of course exams, you will check that yes, they are testing with accommodations. And then in each of the content tests that they will take in that year, you have to mark either supplemental or paper. That's all you have to say, supplemental or paper, but you are indicating that they are utilizing that accommodation and are not taking the full online version. Now, before you ask, I'm going to say, I know that when we send this out, I can guarantee that I'm going to get a million questions about EMIS. That if you are marking yes for accommodations in the section that is reserved for end of course exams, isn't that going to confuse EMIS? And I will tell you, I think it might. But we asked that question and we were told that it didn't matter. That will be worked out at a later date, that is how you are expected to mark it on the IEP. So we did bring it up. We made sure that they knew at the state that we could see that potentially causing problems. Hopefully the EMIS folks will have a way to work around that. And, they certainly can contact the EMIS coordinator at the state if it does become an issue, but hopefully it won't.
Yeah, because the state was saying, let us worry about that. This is what we're telling you to do, and this is what the districts will need to do. So, like I said, we asked, and, hopefully there aren't any major errors or whatever.
Right.
questions before we go on? Okay. There are no longer second raters. Hooray, something good. Not that there was anything bad with second raters. I mean, it was a random selection. However, we're going to talk a little bit more about what is kind of going to be in place of a second rater, but it's a random selection and it's also validity of the test. So we will go to that in the next slide. Oh, well, wait a minute. No, we're not. Oh, we are later. Okay. Before we get to that, because that's a little farther down, do not order supplemental test kits until after the decision has been made concerning which mode the student will use. I've already had many questions about this because what if we're not sure? And, you know, I think that ordering kits or ordering or pre-identifying and ordering was like November 12th through November 27th. And people are saying, you know, give me a break. How do I know for sure? Well, they will have an additional window to order kits February 3rd through March 25th. And like I said at the state meeting, that is late. However, when you're going to order kits, if you're using any supplemental or paper, they don't want you ordering kits for each kid. Or each student, sorry. They are going to want you just to order a couple because then you will reuse them, especially because you can even take the supplemental pieces you need from the whole paper kit. They're going to be much smaller. There's not going to be, well, there won't be the work involved as in the past as far as putting a kit together. There will be a little bit, but they do not want you, and they will probably, if you would order 20 some kits or more,
They'll call you.
They're going to call you because there's going to be, it's like an approval through ODE. It's not an approval to say you can't use supplemental or paper. It's more or less like,
How
hey,
many?
why do you need this many test kits?
Yeah.
It's not an individual, like we kind of started getting it originally. It wasn't that way for the paper pencil test, but in the end, people were ordering, you know, test kits for each kid. Because they had to be used by so many students. So,
and you might be wondering, you know, why are they policing that, so to speak? And the reason is the goal is that the vast majority of students will use the online version, that it will be a very small percentage of students who will utilize the supplemental or the full paper version. And so what they don't want to happen, like Helen was saying, is they don't want you to preemptively order paper or supplemental kits. They want you to wait until after you've made an IEP decision, an IEP team decision about whether the student will use that accommodation. So we're not just blanket ordering kits and then, you know, having students use them before we really weigh whether or not they need that. Because again, their expectation is that the vast majority of students will use the online version only.
and I know we didn't say this before, but if you will be using supplemental or paper, like Dee Dee said, it is accommodation, you will have to amend the IEP to put that in.
Right, so that will have to be documented. Like we said, I already explained how you'll do it. You'll mark section 12, alternate assessment, and then you'll go down to the EOC section and mark testing with accommodation. But Helen brings up a good point. We asked, well, what about the IEPs that are already in existence? And they do expect that you will be amending those. They did say, do the best you can. Don't freak out about the on-time order window that ends at the end of November, because remember, there's an additional window to order kits, and we know that that might feel stressful for people back in the district because, you know, that's the testing window is already open by that point. But bear in mind too that the timeline for testing students should actually be much faster. So most of the students are doing the online version. The teacher's not entering scores. That's all
Right.
done automatically. So that the time commitment from the test administrator should be considerably less. So they don't want everyone kind of stressing and getting panicky about not having all of their tests ordered in that first on-time window. It is perfectly acceptable and expected that you will be placing additional orders in that second window from February 3rd to March 25th. Okay, so the next bullet is about the learner characteristic inventory, and they're calling it the LCI. And that is something relatively new, that the deadline for pre-ID in the system is January 16th. Again, whoever does that reporting, your test coordinator, will have that information and know to do that. It is a questionnaire for the test administrator similar to the SPQ, and it will be recorded in the portal in the same location where you used to report the second rater scores. This is what Helen was kind of referring to earlier, that it will be a random selection just like the second rater was. The difference is this doesn't involve the student, whereas the second rater had to literally sit and observe the student taking the test, and they had to record the student's responses and enter those into the DEI. This is just a questionnaire that the test administrator will complete and upload. So it's, I guess a little less intensive than having a second rater.
Right, and like we said, it'll be random selection, and January 16th is a deadline to pre-ID. You will get that information prior, and kind of like with people remember the SPQ was, where to place the student. It's not a test you give to the student or a questionnaire you give to the student. You answer the question as a teacher. And we did have comments in the past about SPQ, like say it's a high school student. I teach math. This one teaches language arts. Person that knows the student best in that content area should fill out the LCI. And like Dee Dee said, it won't be as intrusive or anything as having a second rater. It'll just be random selection, do that, and it's more or less just for, like the second rater was, validity and validation of, and reliability,
Of the
test.
test. Right, and Helen brings up a good point. If you have a middle school or high school student who has different teachers for different content areas, it's perfectly okay to have different people fill out the LCI. So the math teacher can answer questions related to math. The ELA teacher can answer questions related to ELA, and then only one LCI gets uploaded into the system. Okay,